Hey guys, Mr. Ham here. I want to talk to you a little bit about what the 1970s culture looked like, especially here in the United States, and kind of how it compares to the 1960s and Woodstock and everything that we've talked about in the past. 1970s culture is really unique in that it is kind of a response to the 1960s. You can see, especially in the early 70s, a lot of what was happening was basically a continuation of what was going on in the 60s. The Vietnam War was still going on. There were still protests. The music still reflected that. Everything was still kind of revolving around the war. And then, of course, when the United States exits Vietnam, things start to change. A lot about culture here in the United States starts to change. And one of the first places you can look is the music. The music in the 1960s was very much that protest culture music, dealing with the war, dealing with issues. In the 1970s, it's still there, but it shifts a lot. And the pop music that you see, the stuff that's leading the charts, is kind of easy to listen to pop stuff, things like the Jackson 5, ABC, things like that. People like the Bee Gees, David Bowie, things like that, stuff that's easy to listen to, positive message and everything. Not everything about the 70s was positive. It is an era that is known for the serial killers. You have groups like the Manson family. You have killers like BTK here in the Wichita area. A lot of different ones. Those are interesting stories to kind of look into and some of the motivations. Also, 1970s was a huge, huge time period for blockbuster movies and sets up a lot of what we see in our culture today. Movies like The Godfather, Star Wars, Clockwork Orange, and Grease were all famous movies that came out during this time period. It kind of set up the big summer blockbuster with movies like Jaws. Um, it also extended to television as well. You have TV shows and things like that, like Scooby Doo and everything that still has impact today. Protests were still going on in the 1970s. They shift, of course, from the Vietnam War, we're not in Vietnam anymore, to different things. Women's rights movements continue, the civil rights movement continues, and different groups start fighting for rights as well, kind of as extensions of our civil rights movement here. Gay and lesbian groups start fighting for rights. Groups like Native Americans, different groups here in the United States, start kind of fighting for their rights, kind of off the examples set by the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. This protest here you can see is about nuclear proliferation, so protesting the use of nuclear weapons and the growth of nuclear armaments. Fashion also is a big part of the 1970s. It has a very distinct fashion. Men were wearing very tight suits with bell bottoms, a lot of polyester, a lot of bright colors, wide collars. The women were as well. The colors were bright, and women were wearing things like pantsuits and jeans and things like that, which before this time period was pretty unheard of. Then, of course, you have the sports of the time period that kind of still shapes a lot of our sports today. Groups like the 1972 Miami Dolphins that were the only undefeated team in the NFL. People like Muhammad Ali, one of the greatest boxers, probably the greatest boxer of all time. So as you kind of look through 1970s culture, think about how it impacts us, but also think about how it kind of bridges that gap back to the 1960s and 50s and how it kind of grows from that.